Hi, I'm Toro, and welcome to Toro's History Lullabies. All my life, I've needed a little background noise to fall asleep. For years, it was just the hum of a fan or some soft static. But ever since wireless earbuds came into my life, I've found myself drifting off to podcasts and documentaries, learning and relaxing at the same time. That's why I started making these videos. Calming stories from history, told gently, to help you unwind, learn something new, and hopefully fall asleep a little easier. So get comfortable, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's step quietly into the past. And if you enjoy these stories, I'd love it if you gave the video a like and subscribed for more. Sweet dreams. The Silk Road. A world in motion. Before the roads were drawn and the cities named, the world moved slowly. Across distant valleys and rising hills, winds swept through tall grasses and bent low trees, murmuring secrets only the oldest stones remembered. The rivers, quiet and patient, wandered across the land in long silver threads, carrying the memory of rain through forests, plains, and desert edges. Beneath a sky untouched by smoke or wire, people gathered in small circles, beside fires, beneath stars. In these earliest days, before empires dreamed in marble and silk, the rhythm of life was simple and steady. There were no maps as we know them, only the shapes of mountains against the light and the stories of travelers passed from mouth to mouth. And yet even then, people moved. They followed herds, followed seasons, followed the glint of obsidian in the hills or the shimmer of salt on a dry lakebed. Trade did not begin with coin or parchment, it began with gesture, with offering, with trust. From the winding rivers of Mesopotamia to the highlands of Persia, from the boundless grasslands of the Central Asian steppe to the wooded edges of ancient China, people walked. They rode, they floated, they carried stories and burdens alike. Amber from the Baltic drifted southward, polished smooth by hand in time. Lapis lazuli from the mountains of Bactria found its way east, tucked into pouches of wool and linen. Wool, copper, incense, horses, and gold passed through many hands before arriving in places whose names were unknown to their origins. A single bead might touch a dozen lives before finding rest in the folds of cloth on a foreign wrist. There were routes, yes, but they were not yet the Silk Road. Not yet named, not yet bound together by empire. These were ancestral paths, worn smooth by calloused feet and the pads of animals, unrecorded yet essential. They crossed deserts and rivers and invisible borders drawn only in memory. Every step taken was a step in a long lineage of movement. Even without kings or kingdoms, there was connection. And with connection came wonder. In the west, near the Fertile Crescent, traders gathered beneath date palms and bartered wool for grain, oil for wood. They watched the sun rise orange through dust and measured time in shadows. In the east, jade and silkworms were tended with care, their value understood only by those who held the secrets close. Southward, in the lands of the monsoon, spices stirred in clay pots and shimmered on the tongues of those who tasted them. Northward, beyond the forests, nomadic tribes followed the rhythm of hooves, chasing clouds across the horizon. In these slow currents of exchange, something extraordinary began to take shape. Objects were traded, yes, but so too were stories. A new tune learned in a foreign inn. A whispered tale of a golden palace beside a salt lake. A scrap of cloth with a pattern never seen before. The movement of goods carried the movement of ideas. The smallest things, a coin, a spice, a broken piece of pottery, began to stitch together the fabric of a world. Time moved gently, but it moved forward. Kingdoms grew and receded. Cities rose from dust and fell back into it. Some became legends. Others vanished without a trace. But the paths remained. Invisible, perhaps, but persistent. They lived in the footprints left behind, in the grooves worn into stone, in the bones of animals who once bore cargo across open plains. By the 2nd century before the Common Era, in the east, a new light began to rise. In China, the Han dynasty had come into its strength. From the capital at Chang'an, the empire reached out with steady hands, building walls, forging roads, extending diplomacy beyond its borders. The empire's scholars mapped stars. Its poets recorded dreams. Its artisans shaped silk so fine it seemed spun from moonlight. In the weft and weave of cloth, in the glint of polished bronze, in the silence between verses, the world stirred. But for all its power, the Han court knew little of the lands beyond the mountains and sands. Who lived across the deserts? What kingdoms rose beyond the horizon? What treasures lay beyond the reach of messengers? In time, these questions would draw the first long line on the map. A line not of conquest, but of curiosity. It would not be called the Silk Road for many centuries. It would not be one road, nor even one story. But it would begin in silence, in movement, in the old, patient rhythm of people going forth. The world was already in motion. 2. The birth of the Silk Road. It only needed to be named. In the far east of the ancient world, behind mountains laced with mist and valleys nourished by rivers, the Han dynasty had begun to grow like a tree pressing steadily toward the sky. Its roots ran deep into the soils of older dynasties, into the memory of warring states, into the ancestral rites and rituals of a people long practiced in patience. By the 2nd century before the Common Era, the Han court in Chang'an pulsed with quiet authority. Its streets were lined with markets and scholars, its walls held murals, incense, silk, and song. Within the palace complex, beneath lacquered beams and silk-draped eaves, sat Emperor Wu. He ruled not only with armies and law, but with vision. His gaze did not rest solely on the rivers and hills of his own lands. He turned his eyes westward, toward places unknown. Stories drifted into court from travelers and hunters, from soldiers who had glimpsed distant peaks. Tales of peoples who rode swift horses through high valleys. Of kingdoms that traded gold for wool, whose kings drank from silver cups and spoke languages wrapped in strange syllables. Of stallions strong enough to carry warriors for days without rest. Horses unlike any in the Han stables. Among these tales, one in particular took hold. Far beyond the human pass, beyond deserts that swallowed the horizon, there was said to be a kingdom with horses of great size and power. Their chests were broad, their necks arched like bowstrings. They were called the heavenly horses, and Emperor Wu, seated in the heart of his flourishing empire, longed to possess them. Not simply for pride. These horses, it was said, could carry warriors across the vast northern plains where the empire faced the restless Xiongnu. A cavalry mounted on such beasts might shift the balance of the frontier. But how to reach them? In the year 138 BCE, Emperor Wu summoned a man. His name was Zhang Qian. A court official, quiet in manner and loyal in purpose, Zhang Qian was chosen not for fame, but for endurance. His mission was one of diplomacy, to journey west in search of an alliance with the Yuezhi, a nomadic group believed to dwell beyond the lands of the Xiongnu. These people, once driven from their ancestral homeland, might now prove useful allies against China's northern threat. It was no small task. The path ahead was not marked by milestones or maps. It was scattered with danger, veiled in silence. Still, Zhang Qian accepted. With a small retinue and imperial blessings, he rode into the unknown. He never reached the Yuezhi, not then. Shortly after leaving the borderlands of Han China, Zhang Qian was captured by the Xiongnu, the same nomads he had hoped to flank. They held him in captivity for over 10 years. A full decade spent among the tents and tundra, living under a foreign sky. He married. He waited. He learned. Time passed as it does in wide, wind-scoured places, slowly, quietly, with seasons as punctuation. And then one night, in silence and darkness, he escaped. Still resolute, Zhang Qian did not turn back toward Chang'an. Instead, he pushed forward into the lands of legend. He crossed mountains and deserts. He entered valleys where the air smelled of snowmelt and distant flowers. He passed into Dayuan, the kingdom of the heavenly horses. He saw them grazing in green pastures, their bodies gleaming with strength. From there, he continued westward, deeper still. In Bactria, where Greek cities still stood in the shadows of the Himalaya, he found a world unlike anything known in Han lands. Columns carved with unfamiliar gods. Silver coins bearing the profile of Alexander's heirs. Traders who wore woven tunics and drank wine in shaded courtyards. In the markets, he saw glass and ivory. He heard the tongues of Persia and India mingled with Central Asian speech. And he learned that silk, Chinese silk, was already here. Worn by kings. Sold in bazaars. Revered in lands where no Chinese envoy had ever stepped. Somehow, across an invisible ocean of desert and stone, silk had made the journey without its makers. Passed from hand to hand, traded and treasured, it had crossed the known world. When Zhang Qian finally returned to China, 13 years after he had first departed, he brought with him no great alliance. The Yuezhi, he had found, had moved too far to be of use. But he returned with something far more enduring, knowledge. He spoke of kingdoms, Dayuan, Bactria, Parthia. Of strange coins and fast horses. Of grapes, unfamiliar foods, and flowering trees that bloomed in spring and bore fruits unlike any seen in the East. He spoke of vast distances, of bustling cities with gates wide enough to welcome elephants. Of people who had never heard of the Han, yet wore the silks they wove. His words lit a quiet flame in the emperor's court. Zhang Qian's mission proved that the world beyond was not a mystery sealed in myth, it was real, reachable, intricate. It could be mapped. Connected. Perhaps even guided. The emperor, always mindful of threats and opportunities alike, saw what lay before him. Over the years that followed, the Han court invested in the West. New missions were dispatched. Routes were scouted. Garrisons were built at critical junctures. The Gansu Corridor, a long passage of narrow plains squeezed between mountain and desert, became the backbone of China's western reach. Outposts like Dunhuang were fortified. Roads were widened. Wells dug. Supply lines secured. The Human Pass, Jade Gate, became a threshold between worlds. And with every journey, more threads were drawn together. Traders brought silk westward. In return came jade, horses, spices, ivory, furs, musical instruments, and knowledge. No single merchant traveled the entire distance from China to the Mediterranean. Instead, goods moved through dozens of hands, hundreds of miles, towns strung like beads across the continent. One caravan might journey from Chang'an to Dunhuang. Another would take the goods from Dunhuang to Khotan. Still others would carry them onward, through Bactria, through Sogdia, through the Iranian plateau, into Parthia, Mesopotamia, Syria, and beyond. At each step, something changed. A roll of silk might be repackaged. A spice blended. A coin melted and reforged. The farther a thing traveled, the more stories it gathered. And the road was never a single path. It forked and split and curved, sometimes north, sometimes south. It passed through mountain passes swept with snow, deserts rippling under sun, river valleys green with life. It wove through cultures like thread through cloth, stitching together people who might never meet, but who shared in its rhythm. By the 1st century BCE, the road was alive. It was not yet called the Silk Road. That name would come many centuries later, from scholars looking back. But the network had formed, organic, persistent, human. Alongside silk came paper, lacquerware, tea, bronze mirrors, and ideas. Buddhism, which had flourished in India, began to follow the same paths eastward. Monks traveled with traders. Sutras were copied and carried. Temples were carved into cliffs at Dunhuang and elsewhere, glowing with pigments made from distant lands. From west to east, came not only goods but wonder, glass from the Levant, aloes wood from Arabia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, wool from Central Asia. New styles of painting, new musical instruments, new philosophies arrived, softly, subtly, like wind through a silk curtain. The Silk Road was not simply a route for goods. It was a breath, a long, slow exhale across the continent. It moved at the speed of foot and hoof. Of sandstorms and snowfall. Of borders negotiated with gifts and silences. The road was not imposed. It emerged, through persistence, trust, repetition. Through the courage of those who dared to walk the long way through unknown lands. And so, with each passing decade, the Han Empire became part of something larger. A world gently tied together by silk and story. The journey had begun. 3. Caravans and compass winds. The Silk Road moved not as a river, not as a road of stone or iron, but as a long breath drawn slowly across the world. It bent with the shape of land and memory, paused with the seasons, and rose again with each returning caravan. It was a road that walked at the pace of animals and men. At its heart was the caravan. The caravan did not rush. It moved with measured stillness. A journey across the Silk Road could take many months. Some took years. Others spent lifetimes moving back and forth between oases and mountain passes, never seeing the sea, never knowing the full length of the path they helped sustain. Each caravan began with preparation, weeks, sometimes months of it. Goods were packed in bundles, layered with straw, wrapped in felt, and stitched tight against dust. The camels, chosen for their patience and strength, were groomed and fed, their thick coats brushed to dislodge burrs, their burdens gradually increased to accustom them to the coming strain. There were two kinds of camels on the road. The Bactrian camel, used in Central Asia and China, bore two humps and thick wool, and could survive in the cold highlands of the Pamirs and the Mongolian steppes. The dromedary camel, favored in the Middle East and North Africa, had a single hump and slender build, better suited to the dry heat of the southern deserts. Both could go without water for days. Both were stubborn, but dependable. Each camel carried around 300 pounds of cargo, silks, tea bricks, bundles of paper, rolls of brocade, iron tools, and silver. They were loaded carefully and evenly, their loads wrapped in wool to prevent chafing. Handlers would speak to them as they worked, not to command, but to soothe. When the caravan finally departed, it left in early morning. Always early. Before the sun touched the sand, before the winds had gathered. The air was still cool, and the shadows long. The handlers moved from animal to animal with slow movements, checking knots, whispering to one another in low tones. Then the bells rang. Every camel bore a bell, small, copper or iron, tied with woven cord just beneath the neck. No two bells sounded alike. Their soft ringing gave the caravan its voice, a quiet, steady music that helped travelers track each other in low visibility and soothed the animals through monotony. In the morning hush, the bells shimmered in the air like dew on leaves. The caravan wound slowly out of the city gate, out into the open world. Its members were varied. Some were experienced traders, their beards gray with desert wind. Others were hired guards, armed with sabers and bows. There were cooks, animal tenders, translators. Sometimes Buddhist monks joined, carrying scrolls bound in linen, their heads shaven, their movements precise. Sometimes musicians traveled with the group, earning passage with song. The caravan was not a single people, but a rhythm of many, united by the shared contract of distance. They walked. Across the Gansu corridor, the land narrowed between the Chilean mountains and the vast northern steppe. It was a dry plain, whipped by wind, but dotted with oases, brief islands of poplar and willow, wells deep and lined with stone. Villages clung to rivers that ran thin in the summer, fed by snowmelt from peaks far above. The trail here was rutted, carved by centuries of hooves and wheels. Way stations stood every 30 to 50 kilometers, marked by clay walls and low lanterns that glowed in the blue dusk. These posts offered millet gruel, a bed of reed mats, and shelter from the wind. Messages were passed along from caravan to caravan. Who had left before? What news from Samarkand? Had the roads near Dunhuang been flooded again? Beyond Gansu, the land opened wider into the Darim Basin, and with it, the great Taklamakan Desert. Here the journey grew quiet. The name Taklamakan meant, "He who enters does not return," and though the old stories warned of ghosts and vanishing trails, still the caravans crossed it. But they did not cross it directly. They followed its northern or southern rim, tracing the chain of oases like beads on a cord. These oases were small kingdoms unto themselves. Khotan, known for its white jade and fine carpets. Naya, half buried in the dunes, its orchards fed by underground springs. Kashgar, the great turning point, where routes split north and south, east and west. In each oasis, a small government oversaw the water, protected the wells, and taxed the goods that passed through. Rest days were taken here. Camels were unburdened. Trade was negotiated in shaded courtyards, over flatbread and pomegranate juice. The desert itself offered little. The wind came in long sighs. The sun burned white. The dunes whispered, reshaping themselves endlessly. Travelers wore layers of linen to reflect the heat, wrapped their heads in wool scarves, and tied felt slippers over sandals. The sand was pale, but the shadows beneath the animals were sharp and dark. Fires were made from camel dung, mixed with straw and left to dry. Meals were simple, lentils, rice, sometimes salted fish carried from faraway lakes. And always, they walked. When the heat of the day grew unbearable, the caravan halted. Tents were set up quickly, poles driven into sand, canvas stretched low. Some men slept. Others boiled tea over embers. It was not strong tea, just enough to keep the mouth moist. In some camps, songs were sung softly in Sogdian or Turkic, their melodies winding through the still air like water through reeds. The evening brought relief. The wind changed. The light cooled. The caravan resumed its journey, walking until the moon rose high enough to show the trail. Beneath stars unfamiliar to some and sacred to others, the desert opened itself again. The soft clatter of bells returned. Some camels muttered in their throats. A fox darted between dunes. And the road kept moving. Further west, the land shifted once more. The trail climbed into the Pamir Mountains, a range of stone and snow so vast and cold that even summer left frost on the peaks. Here the air grew thin. Breath came slower. Caravans narrowed. Each traveler had to carry more on his back and speak less with his voice. The silence of the mountains was heavy, broken only by distant avalanches or the sudden cry of an eagle. The mountain passes were sacred to many. Offerings were left at the highest points, ribbons tied to stone cairns, coins pressed into crevices, prayers murmured in many tongues. To pass through was to be reminded of one's smallness. But it was also to see far, to look down on valleys where smoke rose from yurts, where rivers cut silver paths through the green. Then came the steppes. The Central Asian steppes were grasslands that moved with wind and hooves. Nomadic peoples lived here, Saka, Ueji, Scythians, dwelling in felt-covered yurts, riding horses with silent grace. Their herds roamed free, sheep, goats, cattle, ponies. They did not build cities, but they understood the sky. The stars were their compass, and the seasons their clock. Caravans were welcomed here, though cautiously. Gifts were exchanged, salt, wine, bolts of cloth, beads. Hospitality was formal. Guests were seated on rugs. Tea was poured. Dried cheese and meat offered in small wooden bowls. And when the fire burned low, songs were shared, old ones, passed from mother to daughter, father to son, carried across the plains for generations. The trade here was as much in language and knowledge as in goods. In one camp, a trader might learn of a new route across the Tian Shan Mountains. In another, he might meet a healer who taught the use of a rare herb. In yet another, he might be shown a piece of Roman glass, pale blue, translucent, shaped like a leaf, brought all the way from Antioch. These moments made the Silk Road what it was. Not just a route for silk, though silk flowed like water from the east. But a web for everything, perfumes from Arabia, amber from the Baltic, nutmeg from the islands of the south. Lapis lazuli. Ceramics. Slippers embroidered with thread made from gold. Bamboo flutes. Copper mirrors. Manuscripts written on birch bark. All of it moving, slowly, bundled and felt, passed between hands. Even ideas moved this way. Buddhist monks carried teachings westward, their texts translated from Sanskrit to Chinese, then into Sogdian, then into Greek. Stories traveled too, tales of desert spirits, of buried cities, of dragons that guarded emerald pools. The stories changed with each telling, but something of their heart remained. At last, the caravan reached a great city. Perhaps Samarkand, with its gardens and tiled walls, where water ran in carved channels beside the market stalls. Or Merv, where the sun lit the domes like gold coins. Or Bactra, where Greek columns still stood among almond trees. Or perhaps only a smaller post, no grand gate, but a courtyard shaded by mulberry trees, a stone well, a place to rest. Here the goods were laid out, unwrapped, admired. Silk in bolts and cords, dyed crimson or moss green, patterned with clouds or cranes. Ceramic bowls that rang like bells when tapped. Carved ivory. Tea in bricks, wrapped in bark. Letters in wax-sealed packets. And everywhere, voices. Voices in many tongues. Offers, refusals, laughter. The tone of trade. The cadence of culture. And then, rest. Not just the rest of evening, but a true pause. The caravan stayed for days, perhaps weeks. Camels were washed and shorn. Loads rearranged. New travelers joined. Some would continue west. Others would turn back east, carrying new treasures, new news, new questions. And so the Silk Road continued, not as a thing that could be finished, but as a rhythm that repeated. A slow, faithful rhythm of movement. Of bells, and feet, and wind. Of patience. Of endurance. Of breath. 4 Oases of civilization. In the vast quiet of the Silk Road, where wind carved the dunes and stars lit the plains, the oases were havens. They were the breathing spaces of the world, a place where the road exhaled. For the weary traveler, an oasis meant more than water. It meant rest. Safety. Conversation. Trade. It meant color after weeks of dust. Laughter after silence. Music where before there had only been hoofbeats and bells. To those who called the oases home, the caravans were not interruptions, they were lifeblood. Their cities grew not despite the desert, but because of it. Each arrival brought news, flavors, coins, fabrics, beliefs. The world came to their gates and left transformed. Among these oases, a few became jewels in the web of trade. Not capitals of empires, but nodes of culture, where languages mingled like streams, and the breeze through cypress trees carried the scent of 10 kingdoms. Dunhuang, gateway to the sands. Near the edge of the Gobi Desert, where the Chinese frontier once blurred into the wild unknown, stood Dunhuang, the last outpost before the great journey west. To the east, it was the end of the Han world. To the west, it was the beginning of everything else. Dunhuang was not large, but it was sacred to travelers. Here, the great walls of China gave way to open sky. Here, the desert's breath began. Its wells were deep and cold. Its trees rustled in the hot wind, and its streets swirled with dust and incense. By day, Dunhuang's markets buzzed. Han officials in long robes traded with Sogdian merchants in tall wool hats. Persian traders offered turquoise and tin. Bactrian horsemen arrived with saddlebags full of dried fruit and carved bone. Pilgrims moved silently through the streets, prayer wheels in hand, their eyes lowered, their minds already somewhere else. But it was at night that Dunhuang's soul revealed itself. At the edge of the city, carved into the cliffs of Mingsha Shan, were the Mogeo caves, temples in stone, hand-carved by monks and artists, lit by flickering oil lamps. Their walls were alive with color. Deep blues, warm golds, soft greens, scenes of the Buddha's life, of guardians and musicians, of travelers crossing deserts under the protection of celestial beings. Paintings were commissioned by merchants, carved by local artisans, and preserved by sand. They held not just faith, but memory. In these caves, the Silk Road left its trace, not in coins or maps, but in pigments and brushstrokes. And though empires would fall, the caves would endure, their colors whispering across centuries. Kashgar, the city of turning roads. At the western edge of the Taklamakan, where the roads of the north and south branches of the Silk Road met again, stood Kashgar. It was older than memory. A city of traders, translators, and crossroads. It sat like a great basin into which all journeys poured. The air smelled of dust, stone, and spice. Minarets rose above flat roofs. Cypress trees lined shaded courtyards. And the streets were alive. On market days, the noise began at dawn. Potters set out their wares, bowls glazed with cloud patterns, jars etched with vines. Tanners stretched leather in the sun. Jewelers hammered silver into bracelets shaped like serpents and birds. Traders stood in doorways speaking in 5 languages. Children chased chickens through the alleys. Scribes copied letters for merchants too busy to write. Storytellers gathered crowds in the tea houses, their voices rising and falling with ancient tales. At the heart of the city stood the Idaho Ka Square, a place where one could hear everything and see everyone. The sound of flutes mixed with the scent of roasting lamb. Silk rustled against wool. Laughter echoed from shaded arcades. Distant chants called the faithful to prayer. Kashgar was not a place of permanence. It changed with every season. In the spring, horses from Fergana arrived in long lines. In summer, caravans from Chang'an brought bolts of brocade. In autumn, traders from Samarkand came with melons and salt. In winter, the snow came down from the mountains and hushed the city like a blanket. But through it all, life moved on, steady, curious, and wide awake. Samarkand, city of sapphire and song. To the west, beyond deserts and river valleys, across the stone spine of the mountains, lay Samarkand. It shimmered. Its domes, like turned bowls of lapis, caught the sun and glowed. Its walls were painted in blues and golds, with geometric patterns that danced like water. Its gardens bloomed with roses, jasmine, and pomegranate trees. And its air was thick with song. Samarkand was no mere stop. It was a destination. Founded by Alexander. Ruled by Persians. Later crowned by Timur, the great conqueror. But even in earlier days, it had been a meeting place, a hearth for cultures. Here, Greek statues stood near Zoroastrian temples. Buddhist monks walked beside Sogdian bankers. Syriac Christians, Persian poets, and Indian traders all found space to speak. The markets were full of perfume and color. Spices spilled from baskets, saffron, clove, cumin, black cardamom. Glassware from Syria gleamed in wooden trays. Scrolls from India, wrapped in silk. Carpets from Anatolia, thick and soft, their patterns like maps of dreams. And in every hand, coins, Roman denarii, Parthian drachmas, Chinese spades, all mingled together in the trade. Samarkand's schools taught languages. Its scholars debated medicine, astronomy, geometry, and faith. Its towers watched the stars. And when the sun set, music began, flutes, lutes, zither, voices carried on the cooling wind. For the traveler, Samarkand was rest and wonder. For the merchant, it was opportunity. For the student, it was a library of the world. Merv, Balkh, and the gardens of the West. Beyond Samarkand, the road stretched into the greener lands of the Iranian plateau and Central Asia's western frontiers. Here, the oases softened into cities with gardens. Merv, a place where the sun rose gently over water channels lined with poplars. A place of libraries and tiled courtyards. Here, scribes copied books onto parchment made from stretched hide, and caravans rested for weeks at a time. Balkh, older still, was once called the mother of cities. Its temples had echoed with Buddhist chants before the age of empires. Its markets smelled of mint and warm bread. Its streets were paved with smooth stones worn flat by centuries of footfall. Here, the Silk Road took on the air of settled civilization. The architecture of desert dwellings gave way to stone homes with shaded verandas and cisterns. Wells were deep and sweet. Pomegranates grew in walled orchards. The call to prayer drifted through the streets, woven with the sound of wind chimes and distant laughter. Trade here was more formal. Contracts written in multiple scripts. Warehouses tall and clean. Deals sealed with handshakes, oaths, and sometimes arranged marriages between merchant families. Silk was re-dyed, blended, rewoven. Spices were blended and branded. Horses were tested for speed and bone. Ideas, too, were refined, smoothed like river stones in the slow current of peace. The shape of an oasis. Not every oasis was a great city. Many were small. A single pool of water. A grove of tamarisk trees. A stone well ringed with camels. A village of no more than 50 homes, but every one familiar with travelers. In these places, life followed the sky. The morning began with water drawn by rope and pulley. Goats milked. Bread baked in clay ovens. Children ran beside the caravan, laughing. Men traded gossip. Women examined the fabrics the travelers brought. Elders sat beneath mulberry trees, their eyes half closed, listening to languages they did not speak, but understood in rhythm. Hospitality was not questioned. A stranger was fed. A guest was a sacred trust. And when the sun set, fires were lit. The tea was poured. The same stars seen over Chang'an and Antioch glimmered above the tents, unchanged by empire or war. A pause, not an ending. Each oasis on the Silk Road offered more than survival. It offered interruption. In the long sentence of the journey, it was a comma, a breath, a place where motion ceased for a moment, and reflection filled the space. It was in the oases that the road remembered what it was for. Not just for profit, but for contact. For the sound of foreign music. The color of unknown fruits. The silence of a stranger's prayer. The first time someone tasted cinnamon. Or saw their language written in another hand. Or held a coin with a face they could not name. The Silk Road passed through cities, yes. But the oases were its soul. Here, the movement of goods became the movement of culture. And the movement of culture became memory. Memory in paint. In fabric. In wall carvings and footpaths. In recipes, in poems, in the way light fell through a lattice screen. Even now, those traces remain, in dust, in ruin, in song. The oases of the Silk Road do not vanish. They settle. They wait. Their wells grow silent. But beneath the sand, the water still remembers. And the road, though long, still turns toward them. 5. Encounters and exchanges. The Silk Road was built on movement. Of camels and carts, of caravans and coins. But its truest legacy was not fabric or metal. It was the quiet, enduring exchange of minds. Wherever traders met, something passed between them, often more lasting than the goods they carried. Not every exchange was counted or named. Some were barely noticed at the time, a gesture, a borrowed word, the gift of a song. Others shifted the course of entire civilizations. These were the encounters that made the Silk Road more than a trade route. They made it a bridge between worlds. Languages of the road. No traveler walked the full length of the Silk Road. But their voices did. Words traveled farther than feet. Across the miles, languages mixed, adapted, echoed. A merchant from Luoyang might know a few phrases of Sogdian. A guide from the Iranian plateau might speak Turkic, Greek, and bits of Sanskrit. A scribe in Merv might write in Syriac, Parthian, and Arabic. All on the same scroll. Some became the lingua franca of the route. Sogdian, the language of the traders from Central Asia, was spoken from the Darim Basin to the shores of the Caspian Sea. Its script appeared in letters, on trade contracts, on the walls of inns and caves. Chinese monks translated Buddhist texts into Sogdian before they ever reached the scholars of the Tang court. Writing, too, was exchanged. The elegant brushstrokes of Chinese joined the blocky forms of Aramaic, the cursive lines of Persian, and the angular script of Brahmi. Even coins told stories, minted in one land, but worn smooth by passage through many. Every language carried more than words. It carried perspective. A proverb here, a riddle there, a way of measuring time, a way of describing color or wind or silence. Each encounter added something to the road's shared vocabulary. Faiths in motion. Alongside language came belief. No border could stop it. From India came Buddhism. First as a murmur, then as a chorus. Monks in saffron robes followed the trade routes westward and eastward, carrying palm leaf manuscripts wrapped in linen and tied with twine. They stopped in oasis towns, where they copied scriptures, taught the Dharma, and built small shrines with earthen bricks. At Dunhuang, they carved caves into the sandstone cliffs. Inside, they painted the life of the Buddha in 1,000 colors. Stories of renunciation, compassion, and rebirth unfolded in spirals across ceilings and walls. Travelers knelt in front of candlelit statues. Some left coins. Others left prayers scratched into the stone. Buddhism blended with the beliefs it met. In Gandhara, it took on Greco-Roman form, statues of the Buddha with wavy hair, tunics draped over one shoulder, hands in graceful mudras. In China, it mingled with Taoism and Confucian ethics, giving rise to new schools of thought. Other faiths traveled too. Zoroastrianism, the ancient religion of Persia, left its mark in fire temples along the Iranian plateau. Its emphasis on light, truth, and cosmic balance resonated with many travelers. Nestorian Christianity, a branch often exiled from the Roman world, traveled eastward. Christian monks reached China by the 7th century, erecting stone crosses in cities where Buddhist chants filled the air. In Xi'an, a Nestorian stele carved in 781 CE recorded the Christian mission in both Syriac and Chinese. Judaism, too, had a presence, quiet, enduring. Jewish merchants settled in trading cities, their customs adapting to local norms, their scrolls carried in cedar boxes across thousands of miles. Later, Islam would come, reshaping the Western Silk Road, bringing with it not only theology but science, architecture, and law. The road did not judge. It listened. And in listening, it changed. The exchange of art and form. Objects on the Silk Road were more than tools. They were carriers of memory and vision. A ceramic bowl glazed in cobalt blue might show Persian influence in a Chinese workshop. A textile from Bactria might be embroidered with Indian lotus patterns using Roman dyes. A bronze mirror might bear both Han dragons and Sogdian inscriptions. Artists copied what they admired. And what they admired traveled far. Glass, once a Western specialty, amazed Chinese artisans. It was translucent, colored, light. Glassmakers in Syria and Alexandria passed their knowledge eastward, and by the Tang dynasty, Chinese workshops were experimenting with similar techniques, blending sand and ash, copper and quartz, into shimmering new forms. Paper, first developed in Han China, spread west. Carried by scholars and scribes, it reached Samarkand by the 8th century, then Baghdad, and finally Andalusia. The knowledge of papermaking passed hand to hand, town to town, until it transformed the written cultures of Europe and the Islamic world. Even music moved across the road. Lutes, flutes, and harps of different shapes made their way from Persia to China and back again. The pipa, a beloved Chinese string instrument, has ancestors in Central Asia and India. Rhythms changed. Scales bent. Songs were remembered in new keys. Art was not kept in place. It wandered. And wherever it wandered, it wove itself into the local cloth. Food and flavor. The Silk Road also carried taste. From China came peaches, apricots, and tea, leaves pressed into bricks and boiled in great kettles. From India, cinnamon, cardamom, pepper, and ginger, packed in wax jars and traded like gold. From the Mediterranean, olives, wine, and cheese traveled east. Along the route, caravans carried dried fish, figs, dates, nuts, saffron, and rock sugar. Onions and garlic crossed borders. Chickpeas and lentils found new homes in distant stews. Even cooking methods moved. Tandoor ovens appeared in Central Asia. Wok cooking spread westward. A flatbread in one land became a pancake in another. A dumpling became a mantai, became a momo, became a steamed bun. Travelers remembered meals long after they forgot conversations. The food of the road became the food of cities. And the food of cities became a recipe for connection. Ideas without borders. Beyond goods, beyond faiths, beyond music or taste, the Silk Road carried thought. Scientific knowledge moved steadily west and east. From the Indian subcontinent came mathematics, concepts of zero, the decimal system, astronomical charts. From China came alchemy, medicine, acupuncture, and theories of balance, yin and yang, fire and water, wood and metal. From Persia and the Islamic world came medicine, astronomy, and geometry. Translations flowed from Sanskrit to Arabic, from Chinese to Persian, from Greek to Syriac. Knowledge was not hoarded. It was rewritten. The great libraries of Merv, the schools of Balkh, the observatories of Samarkand, and the temples of Chang'an all studied the same sky, asked the same questions. What are stars made of? What causes illness? How does time move? What lies beyond the edge of the known? Students carried scrolls on their backs, like merchants bore silk. Their words traveled faster than armies. There were no borders for thought. Faces in the crowd. No history can name every person who walked the Silk Road. But their presence endures in what they left behind. The Sogdian merchant, who spoke 6 languages, married into 3 cities, and built a house with paintings of Roman heroes and Chinese sages. The Buddhist nun, who carried relics through the mountains, her robes patched but her scrolls dry. The Persian physician, who taught herbal remedies in Chang'an and kept notes in both Arabic and Chinese. The Turkic guide, whose songs helped keep pace through the desert. Each was a thread. Not a hero. Not a conqueror. Just a human moving forward, passing something on. And so the tapestry grew. A world stitched by contact. The Silk Road was not always peaceful. There were wars, plagues, greed. Empires rose with iron and fell with fire. Routes shifted. Cities vanished beneath dunes. But even in uncertainty, the road endured. Because what it carried could not be erased. It carried a memory of connection. A memory of difference made familiar. Of seeing the foreign not as threat, but as invitation. Of hearing a new song and humming it back. Of learning to count in another tongue. Of painting a mountain you've never seen, because someone described it so well. In the quiet exchanges of the Silk Road, in the smile over a shared meal, the handing over of a spice, the unrolling of a scroll, the lighting of a lamp inside a painted cave, civilization moved not by conquest, but by contact. And though the road would change, narrow, fade, and fracture, these encounters endured. They endure still. In language. In food. In belief. In melody. In us. 6. The Maritime Silk Road and Southern Currents. Target, 1, 500, 2,000 words actual, 1, 705 words. While the overland Silk Road crossed deserts and steppes, another path traced the contours of the sea. It did not move with camels or caravans, but with sails and tides. It drifted with monsoon winds, followed stars reflected on waves, and linked cities by the rhythm of salt and swell. This was the Maritime Silk Road, not a single route, but a pattern of coastal exchanges that connected China to Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and the coastlines of East Africa. Its movement was slower, more seasonal, but no less vital. Where the land route tied cities together like beads, the sea route connected archipelagos, deltas, and harbors across a warm blue world. Ports of departure. In southern China, long before any map bore its name, the harbor city of Guangzhou stirred with wind and trade. There, in the estuaries where rivers met the South China Sea, the docks were heavy with motion. Ships were loaded with silk and ceramics, lacquerware and tea. Cargoes were wrapped in oilcloth and secured with knotted hemp. Sails were sewn from woven palm. Ropes coiled in the hands of quiet, barefoot deckmen. And when the tides were right, the sails were raised. The ships, broad, strong-bellied vessels called junks, were built for endurance. They carried small crews, lived in cabins, bamboo steering oars, and red or tan sails that billowed like wings. Some bore flat keels for shallow deltas. Others were made to cross open ocean. Painted eyes sometimes adorned the prows, warding off danger, watching the sea. Departure was timed with care. In the summer months, the southwest monsoon pushed winds from Africa and India toward China and Southeast Asia. In the winter, the northeast monsoon reversed the current. These steady winds, known for their predictability, created a rhythm to maritime trade, 2 directions, 2 seasons, 2 chances each year to move between worlds. The ships followed the winds. South along the coast of Vietnam, into the Gulf of Thailand, past the green isles of Kampa and the stilt houses of river deltas. The sea glistened with heat. The nights echoed with the cry of seabirds and the slap of waves against wood. Dolphins followed. Lanterns swung gently from masts. Southeast Asia, crossroads of the tropics. The ships arrived at port cities where ocean and jungle met. At Oceo and Funan, at Srivijaya and Palembang, traders anchored among fleets from across the ocean world. Here, islanders brought coconuts and sandalwood. Traders from Java offered nutmeg and clove. Ships from India brought coral and cotton. Chinese sailors disembarked carrying silk, coins, scrolls, mirrors, and porcelain bowls shaped like open lotus blossoms. The markets were a blend of humidity and color. Spices piled in wicker trays. Monkeys called from fig trees. Temples carved from jungle stone echoed with the thrum of gongs. Parrots mimicked traders' voices. Priests watched silently from shrines built atop pyramids of green moss and weathered brick. It was here that Buddhism and Hinduism spread side by side, carried by monks and merchants alike. Stone carvings of the Buddha sat beside sculptures of Vishnu and Shiva. The temples rose from the jungle floor like memory made solid. The air was thick with incense, sea salt, and the perfume of orchids. India, heart of the ocean trade. From Southeast Asia, the ships sailed westward across the Bay of Bengal, landing on the broad shoulders of the Indian subcontinent. They entered harbors like Tamralipti, Kavaripattinam, and Maziris, places where river and sea embraced, and where markets bloomed with sound. India was no stranger to the sea. For centuries, its sailors had read the stars and the swells. Its merchants had sold cotton, indigo, and spices. Its scholars had charted the heavens and copied texts onto palm leaves. The arrival of Chinese ships was neither surprise nor novelty, it was continuity. The markets here were dense and layered. Jasmine flowers floated in carved stone bowls. Ink was ground from soot and shell. Pottery, smooth as silk, lined the walkways. Elephants passed slowly through the crowd. Drummers kept a slow, steady rhythm beneath banyan trees. And amid it all, deals were made, salt for pearls, silk for cinnamon, scrolls for glass. In India, the Chinese met traders from the West. Arabs, Persians, and Africans arrived in broad-hulled dhows, sails billowed with wind, prows carved in arcs. They brought frankincense, myrrh, and gold dust from the Horn of Africa. They brought horses from Arabia, glassware from Mesopotamia, and knowledge drawn from centuries of ocean travel. Here, the world compressed. Not in speed, but in closeness. Beliefs mingled. Words shifted. Dyes bled into new patterns. And the Silk Road, though still called by land, found a mirror in the sea. Arabia and the Gulf, deserts by the shore. Following the arc of the Arabian Sea, ships continued west, along the coast of Oman, up into the Persian Gulf. Here, in the harbors of Suhar, Kalhat, and Siraf, the desert reached down to touch the ocean. Whitewashed houses stood behind high stone walls. Minarets rose over the harbors. Carpets hung from wooden frames to dry in the sun. And the scent of frankincense, cut from trees in the mountains of Dhofar, wove through every alley. Traders from China stepped ashore into markets already ancient. Dates dried on racks beside piles of lapis and coral. Arabic calligraphy adorned clay jars. In the corners of shops, old men recited poetry while children weighed saffron on brass scales. The ships offloaded silk and porcelain, taking on bundles of incense, gemstones, and horses bound for Indian and Southeast Asian courts. They lingered in port until the wind turned. And when it did, the sails rose again. Africa, the far western shore. Farther still, beyond the curve of the Arabian coast, past Aden and into the Red Sea, the trade reached the Swahili coast, East Africa. There, in ports like Mogadishu, Kilwa, and Mombasa, goods from across the Indian Ocean arrived on stone docks beneath the blazing sun. African traders offered ivory, ambergris, ebony, and gold. Chinese ceramics were found in their homes, blue and white dishes laid into floors, shards buried in the soil beside coral foundations. These were not accidents. They were the marks of familiarity. Here, languages mixed again, Arabic, Swahili, Persian, Gujarati. Here, the architecture shifted, courtyards shaded by coral stone, painted doors inlaid with brass, wooden beams carved with floral script. Mosques echoed with the sea breeze. Schools taught the Quran beside texts on astronomy and navigation. And though few Chinese ships sailed so far, their goods traveled in layers, passed ship to ship, port to port, until they reached shores beyond the known map. The sea's memory. Like the overland road, the maritime Silk Road left no single trace. No line drawn in stone. Only scattered signs, porcelain shards on a beach. Chinese coins in Sri Lankan fields. Arabic inscriptions found in southern Chinese ports. Words, tastes, instruments, and designs that migrated without name. But the sea remembered. The sea carried sound. It carried song. It carried the rhythm of oars and the low chant of sailors. It carried the scent of cloves and the quiet of fog. It carried the color of dyed sails and the murmur of markets beside harbors where the world arrived. And in every tide, there was return. The monsoons did not allow for recklessness. They required knowledge. They required patience. Those who sailed the maritime Silk Road knew not only direction, but time. They waited. They watched the clouds. They read the birds. They trusted the current. And when the wind turned, they followed it home. 7. twilight empires and gentle decline. The Silk Road was never fixed in stone. It moved with rivers, seasons, and the rise and fall of those who claimed to guard it. And as surely as it had once expanded across deserts and mountains, so too did it begin to withdraw, slowly, softly, like a tide leaving behind the shimmer of salt on sand. There was no single moment of collapse. No trumpet call, no wall crumbling into dust. Only a change in the rhythm. A long exhale. A new direction in the wind. Empires in shadow. The Silk Road had always depended on stability, on the steady presence of empires large enough to secure its length, to protect caravans, to regulate trade, and to keep the oasis towns alive. When these powers weakened, the road lost its structure. In the east, the Tang dynasty, once a patron of open borders and far-reaching diplomacy, began to fracture in the 9th century. Rebellions burned through provinces. The frontiers grew restless. The Inlushan rebellion, in particular, shook the dynasty's confidence and strained its grip on the western regions. In the west, the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, though culturally vibrant, began to fracture into smaller states and emirates. Unity faded. The Persian heartland splintered under local rule. The great roads that had once carried silks and scrolls between Samarkand and Syria began to fall into disrepair. In Central Asia, the once dominant Sogdians, the master traders of the middle routes, saw their cities swallowed by invasion and shifting sands. Their language, once common in every caravanserai from Chang'an to Ctesiphon, faded into memory. And yet, even in decline, life continued. Merchants still traveled. Pilgrims still walked. But the road had lost something essential, coherence. It no longer felt like a thread connecting empires. It became a patchwork, sections bright with commerce, others quiet as forgotten paths. Where once there was rhythm, now there was pause. The rise of the sea. As the land route waned, the sea route grew. The maritime Silk Road, long running in parallel, began to overtake the overland path in significance. Ships grew larger, faster, and more efficient. Port cities flourished in the Indian Ocean world. Coastal empires, like the Chola of South India, the Song dynasty's maritime bureaus, and the later Mamluks and Ottomans, invested in fleets, lighthouses, and deep-water harbors. Spices, porcelain, pearls, textiles, and precious metals flowed with the currents. The cargo of a single ship could now carry what once required months of caravan travel across the desert. And with the sea came new possibilities. Fewer borders. Fewer tolls. Fewer guards and fortresses to negotiate. Storms, yes. But the risks were balanced by speed. And so the great caravans diminished. The camel bells fell silent in some regions. The watchtowers crumbled without repair. The sand, patient and light, began to cover the edges of old trade roads. Black Death and silent cities. In the 14th century, the Silk Road's final twilight deepened. The Black Death, born of fleas and ships, tore through Eurasia with relentless breath. It struck from China to Italy, from Cairo to Samarkand. Trade routes that once brought wealth and wisdom now carried plague. Caravan routes were abandoned. Inns were shuttered. Markets closed their gates. The world recoiled. And when the waves of illness passed, something in the old rhythm was gone. The trust that had once bound distant cities now hesitated. The fear of contact left a silence where commerce had once flourished. Some roads reopened. But they no longer carried the same songs. The Mongol interval. There was, for a brief time, a flickering of strength, an echo of the road's old unity. In the 13th century, the Mongol Empire, under the command of Genghis Khan and his descendants, forged an empire so vast that it stretched from Korea to Hungary. Under their rule, the Silk Road was reborn with unexpected vigor. The Mongols, often remembered for conquest, also brought order, a fierce, organized infrastructure that protected merchants and enforced a strange kind of peace across vast distances. It was called the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. Caravans resumed with confidence. Letters passed from China to Persia in official pouches. Marco Polo walked the road to the court of Kublai Khan. Cities like Karakorum, Bokhara, and Yazd thrived under Mongol oversight. But it did not last. The empire fractured into competing khanates. Roads once patrolled by mounted archers fell into lawlessness again. And the window of unity, so rare and brief, slipped shut. Still, the memory remained. Europe turns west. In the late 15th century, a quiet revolution unfolded, one that would forever change the flow of trade. Sailing ships from Portugal and Spain, newly armed with advanced maps, triangular sails, and cannon, turned not eastward by land, but westward by sea. In 1498, Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached India by water. His journey marked the beginning of direct maritime trade between Europe and Asia, without the intermediaries of Central Asia or the Middle East. The overland Silk Road, long a bridge between East and West, was no longer necessary in the same way. European powers built ports in Goa, Hormuz, Malacca, and later Macau. They established routes not of caravan and compass, but of navy and empire. And so, without violence, without decree, the old road faded further into the background. A fading pulse. Still, the Silk Road did not die. Roads do not die. They empty. They quiet. They wait. In some places, the path remained, a trail of dust beneath high cliffs, a notch worn into stone, a forgotten gate where caravans once rested. In towns like Yarkand, Hotan, and Bokhara, the markets continued, smaller now, more local. The rugs still hung from the walls. The tea was still poured. But the great transcontinental movement had slowed to a whisper. Where once came envoys, now came only a few pilgrims. Where once traveled monks and merchants, now wandered only wind and memory. The Silk Road became legend. And like all legends, it sank into the soil of time, still present, but hidden in plain sight. Enduring traces. Even in quiet, the road endured in other ways. In the faces of Central Asia, where eyes held traces of Turkic, Persian, Mongol, and Chinese ancestry. In the languages, where Persian idioms survived in Uyghur speech, and Sanskrit terms remained in Buddhist texts in Gansu. In food, in music, in architecture, in beliefs stitched together by centuries of movement. The Silk Road lived on in doorways. In songs. In the way a robe was tied. In the spices blended into a morning meal. It lived in shadowed libraries, in painted cave walls, in fragments of silk found in tombs. In the rhythm of lullabies passed from mother to child. It lived not on the surface, but underneath. Silk, like memory. Silk itself, a fabric more than 5,000 years old, remained the symbol of the road. Soft. Strong. Light. Enduring. It unraveled slowly. It wove stories. It crossed borders without force. And even as kingdoms fell, silk survived, hidden in cedar chests, lining the sleeves of scholars, wrapped around relics in forgotten shrines. It remembered. So did the road. Though no longer loud, it continued to whisper, through travelers' journals, through ruins, through place names that echoed older sounds. And in some places, when the wind shifted just right, it was said you could hear the faint chime of camel bells, far off, barely there. Not gone. Just resting. 8 Echoes of the Silk Road. The Silk Road never truly vanished. Even as the caravans thinned, the inns emptied, and the outposts fell silent beneath drifting sands, the path it traced across the world remained. Not as a line on a map, but as a thread in the tapestry of human life. It is there still, in the things we say, the things we eat, the music we hum without knowing its source. It is there in the curve of a dome, in the shape of a bowl, in the warmth of a scarf woven far from where it is worn. The road may have faded from sight, but it has not been forgotten. In words and tongues. Many of the languages once spoken along the Silk Road are now extinct, their final syllables carried off by wind and time. But traces remain. The Sogdian language, once the voice of merchants and messengers, survives in loanwords scattered across Persian, Turkic, and Chinese dialects. The word for market, the word for coin, the name of a spice, these are the fossils of speech. In the Chinese word for grape, putao, we hear a whisper of Persia. In the Arabic word for silk, harir, we feel the threads of China. In modern Uzbek, in the vocabulary of Uyghur traders, in the songs sung by Tajik poets, there are echoes of Sanskrit, Syriac, and Old Turkic, woven together by centuries of listening and learning. Along the Silk Road, translation was an everyday act. A necessity. A kindness. A form of survival. And in that daily crossing of words, new dialects were born, not of conquest, but of contact. In spices and bread. Step into a kitchen in Samarkand, and you may find rice simmered with lamb, raisins, and saffron. Step into a home in Kashgar, and you'll see flatbreads pressed with sesame seeds, baked against the walls of clay ovens. In Xi'an, the air is thick with the scent of cumin, star anise, and vinegar. In Aleppo, pomegranates and walnuts still flavor stews. These are not imported tastes. They are inherited ones. On the Silk Road, food traveled alongside memory. A spice that preserved meat became a staple. A method of kneading, of fermenting, of roasting over open flame, it passed from kitchen to kitchen, carried in the hands of grandmothers and traveling cooks. Even tea, that most rooted of Chinese customs, found new shapes as it moved. In Tibet, it was churned with yak butter. In Bokhara, steeped with cloves and dried apricots. In Turkey, poured black into small tulip-shaped glasses. And in each place, it meant the same thing: rest, welcome, time shared. Recipes became routes. And every meal, a memory of the road. In music and melody. The sounds of the Silk Road still resonate, though the hands that first played them are long gone. The pipa, plucked in Chinese courts, shares ancestry with the Persian oud and the Indian veena. The bowed eru finds cousins in the Central Asian kamancha. The gentle lilt of the flute, the drone of the dutar, the rhythmic pulse of frame drums, these instruments passed through hands like prayer beads. The scales changed. The songs evolved. But in each region, one finds echoes. Listen to a lullaby sung in Uzbekistan. Hear its call and response. Its arc, rising and softening. Then listen again in Western China. The mode is similar. The story is familiar. Only the names have changed. Music moved quietly. It moved through marketplaces and caravans, through weddings and night fires. A traveling musician might earn his place in the caravan not with coin, but with song. And in doing so, he left a piece of melody behind. Like wind through strings, music flowed from east to west, and back again. In belief and story. Though religions rose and fell across the centuries, many of their stories overlapped, and mingled, along the Silk Road. In the caves of Dunhuang, Buddhist murals include images of Greek-style angels and Persian winged guardians. In the synagogues of Kaifeng, Chinese calligraphy retells Hebrew scripture. In the mosques of Bokhara, geometry and verse reflect ideas born not only in Arabia, but in India, Byzantium, and beyond. Ideas did not stop at borders. They bent. Adapted. Combined. A single story, a prince renouncing his throne, a woman healing the sick, a traveler finding wisdom in a desert, might appear in Buddhist, Christian, and Islamic texts, each slightly changed, yet clearly familiar. These were not stolen myths. They were shared ones. Passed from tongue to tongue, translated and retold, like fabrics redyed in new hues. Each new telling was an offering, a way of saying, we, too, believe in something greater than ourselves. And in these beliefs, cultures found not division, but kinship. In cloth and color. Even now, the visual legacy of the Silk Road lives in what we wear, what we admire, what we weave. Silk, once rare and precious, is now familiar. But its patterns still carry ancient stories. Cloud motifs from Han China, floral scrolls from Persia, gold thread work from Byzantium, tie-dye techniques from India's western coast. The ikat, a method of dyeing thread before weaving, appears in the wardrobes of Java, Uzbekistan, and Yemen. Embroidery styles, once distinct, now share techniques. The chain stitch, the couching of gold thread, the use of seed pearls and mirrored glass, these traveled far from their points of origin. And in each stitch lies a memory of motion. A traveler saw a robe. Asked about its make. Brought the idea home. Centuries later, we still wear their influence. Even if we no longer know their names. In maps and memory. Old maps of the Silk Road show it as a path, lines drawn from China to the Mediterranean, pinning down cities like stars in a constellation. But the real Silk Road was never just a line. It was a web, a woven network of shifting paths, shortcuts, and detours, crossing deserts, rivers, forests, and seas. It was shaped by weather, politics, invention, and need. And though the ancient route fell quiet, its shape remained in the structure of cities. Look at Baghdad, planned as a circle. Look at Samarkand, with its radiating markets. Look at Xi'an, where wide roads still follow the ancient Tang dynasty grid. These cities remember the needs of trade, the rhythms of arrival and departure. Even today, train lines and highways sometimes follow the same contours. The Silk Road remains, not only in story, but in structure. It lies beneath us. Like an old song beneath a new one. In the hearts of those who travel. Perhaps the truest echo of the Silk Road is not in objects or customs, but in people. The descendants of the road still live along its length. In Central Asia. In Western China. In Iran. In the Caucasus. In South Asia. In the Levant. They bear the genetic trace of multiple continents. They speak hybrid languages. They prepare hybrid dishes. They sing hybrid songs. They are not one thing. They are many. And that is the road's gift. In a time when borders divide, the Silk Road reminds us of a world once connected, not by empire or conquest, but by movement. By kindness to strangers. By curiosity. By the willingness to carry something new, and offer something of one's own. Still walking. There are those today who retrace the Silk Road, not by caravan, but by foot, bicycle, rail, or camera. They follow its paths through quiet villages and ruined towers. Through markets still warm with saffron and smoke. Through silence, where only dust remembers the old songs. And as they walk, they listen. Not for the sound of camel bells. But for the voice of connection. For the breath of a world once tied together, not by sameness, but by exchange. And in that breath, they find something familiar. A sense that we are not so far from one another. That the road never truly ended. That in our own lives, in our travel, our meals, our greetings, we carry its legacy still. 9. Closing low, night falls over the route. The sun lowers across the desert, warm and slow, casting long shadows behind the dunes. Its light glows gold, then amber, then fades into violet. Another day ends on the Silk Road. The travelers have stopped. Camels kneel in a wide circle, their burdens long since lowered, their legs folded like prayer. Fires are lit in shallow pits. Tea boils in blackened pots. Around it, voices grow softer, until even those fade, and only the wind speaks. This was always the way of the road. Movement by day. Stillness by night. In an old caravanserai beyond Dunhuang, stone walls shelter a few remaining merchants. Their ledgers are closed. A single lamp flickers near the doorway. Above it, painted tiles bear the faded trace of animals once used to guard the gate, dragons and lions, their eyes now worn smooth by time. Inside, on thick woolen blankets, traders from distant places sleep side by side. A Sogdian with a graying beard. A Chinese scholar whose hands are ink-stained. A Turkic horseman whose scarf is tucked beneath his cheek. They do not know each other's stories. But they have shared meals. Laughed. Bargained. Walked the same dust. Now they dream. Across the Pamir Mountains, the stars emerge like coins scattered by a hidden hand. The peaks are outlined in blue, the snow catching the last light. Here, too, the road rests. In a tent set beside a glacial stream, a monk lies beside his scrolls. His fingers still clutch the edge of a copied sutra. The words are steady. His breath even. In Samarkand, the bazaar is empty. The last lamps are doused. The scent of spice lingers, saffron, pepper, dried rose, and somewhere behind a curtain, a lullaby is sung. It is not in any language the monk would know, but the rhythm is familiar. A mother's voice. A child stilled by song. In Kashgar, the gates are closed. The night watchman leans on his spear, listening not for danger, but for the silence between sounds. He has heard it all before, the wind in the poplars, the creak of old wood, the echo of laughter hours gone. Somewhere, a horse shifts. A bell on its halter chimes once. Then stillness. The Silk Road, at night, becomes something else. It is no longer a route. It is a memory in the shape of a path. A thread running through darkness. A breath held across distance. And in this hush, the world feels whole. 1,000 fires once lit this road. Some burned brightly. Others low. All are ashes now. But the heat remains. In painted caves. In folded cloth. In the shape of a city's walls. In the way one person bows to another in greeting. In the timbre of an instrument. In the steam rising from a bowl of spiced broth. In the careful wrapping of gifts in red cloth. In a lullaby that drifts between cultures. The road endures. Tonight, the desert is quiet. The sand cools. The stars grow bold. Somewhere far to the east, near the ruins of Chang'an, a lone traveler reads by candlelight, tracing a map whose lines have long since lost their names. His eyes close before the flame gutters. The scroll curls slightly in the heat. In the west, beyond the old stone cities of Syria and Anatolia, a merchant places a ceramic bowl on a shelf, not knowing its glaze was born from a recipe carried by travelers he will never meet. And in between, over the hills, past the rivers, through the plains and highlands, there is only stillness. The Silk Road sleeps. It is a sleep of centuries. Of wheels no longer turning. Of gates no longer swinging. Of paths softened by wind. But in that sleep, the memory breathes. Gently. Like a tide beneath ice. Like silk in the dark. And in every corner of the world it once touched, something small remains, threaded into music, into food, into belief, into gesture. Soft as dusk. Enduring as stone. A road, not gone, but resting. Waiting. Thanks for spending a little time with me tonight. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a like and subscribe for more gentle journeys into the past. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next one.